After the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, Adonai said to Yehoshua, "Take for yourselves from the people 12 men, a man from every tribe, and give them this order. Take 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan riverbed, where the Kohanim are standing. Carry them over with you and set them down in the place where you camp tonight." Yehoshua called the 12 men whom he had chosen from the people of Israel, a man from every tribe, and said to them, "Go on ahead of the ark of Adonai your God into the riverbed of the Jordan. Then each of you will take a stone on his shoulder corresponding to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel. This will be a sign for you in the future. When your children ask, 'What do you mean by these stones?' you will answer them, 'It's because the water of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of Adonai when it crossed the Jordan. The water in the Jordan was cut off. These stones are to be a reminder of the people of Israel forever." The people of Israel did just as Yehoshua had ordered. They took 12 stones out of the Jordan riverbed, as Adonai had said to Yehoshua, corresponding to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, carried them over with them to the place where they were camping, and set them down there. Yehoshua also set up 12 stones in the Jordan River itself in the place where the feet of the Kohanim carrying the Ark of the Covenant had stood. They are there to this day. The Kohanim carrying the Ark stood in the Jordan riverbed until Yehoshua had finished saying to the people everything that Adonai had ordered him to say, in keeping with everything that Moshe had ordered Yehoshua. Then the people hurried across. When all the people had finished crossing, the ark of Adonai passed on, and the Kohanim ahead of the people. The descendants of Reuben, the descendants of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh went on, armed, ahead of the people of Israel, as Moshe had said to them. Some 40,000 armed soldiers ready for battle crossed in the presence of Adonai to the plains of Jericho. That day Adonai made Yehoshua great in full view of all Israel. They were in awe of him, just as they had been in awe of Moshe all his life. Adonai said to Yehoshua, "Order the Kohanim carrying the ark of the testimony to come out of the Jordan." So Yehoshua ordered the Kohanim, "Come out of the Jordan." The Kohanim carrying the ark of the covenant of Adonai came out from the Jordan riverbed. And as soon as the stones of the feet of the Kohanim touched the dry ground, the water of the Jordan returned to its place, and the river overflowed its banks as it did before. The people came out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and camped at Gilgal by the eastern boundary of the Jericho. Those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua piled up at Gilgal. Then he said to the people of Israel, "In the future, when your children ask their fathers, 'What do these stones mean?' you are to explain to them by saying, 'Israel came over this Jordan on dry land. For Adonai your God dried up the water in the Jordan from in front of you until you had crossed, just as Adonai your God did in the Sea of Suph, which he dried up in front of us until we had crossed. From this all the people of the earth can know that the hand of Adonai is strong, that you can fear Adonai your God forever.'" When all the kings of Emory on the west side of the Jordan and all the kings of the Canaani near the sea heard how Adonai had dried up the Jordan River ahead of the people of Israel until they had crossed it, their hearts failed them. They fell into depression because of the people of Israel. It was at that time that Adonai said to Yehoshua, "Make yourselves knives of flint, and circumcise the people of Israel again a second time." So Yehoshua made himself knives of flint and circumcised the people of Israel at Givat Ha'arlat, the hill of foreskins. The reason Yehoshua circumcised was that all the people who had left Egypt, who were males, all the fighting men, had died in the desert along the way after leaving Egypt. For although all the people who left Egypt had been circumcised, all those who had been born in the desert on the way as they went on from Egypt had not been circumcised. Because the people of Israel walked 40 years in the desert until the whole nation, that is, the fighting men who left Egypt, had died out, because they had not heeded what Adonai said. Adonai had sworn that he would not allow them to see the land which Adonai swore to their ancestors that he would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So he raised up their children to take their place, and it was these whom Yehoshua circumcised. Till then they had been uncircumcised, because they had not been circumcised while traveling. When all the nations had been circumcised, every one of them, they stayed where they were in camp until they were healed. Adonai said to Yehoshua, "Today I have rolled off from you a stigma of Egypt." This is why the place has been called Gilgal, rolling, ever since. The people of Israel camped at Gilgal, and they observed Pesach on the 14th day of the month, there on the plains of Jericho. The day after Pesach they ate what the land produced, matzah, and roasted ears of grain that day. The following day, after they had eaten food produced in the land, the manna ended. From then on, the people of Israel had no longer had manna. Instead, that year, they ate the produce of the land of Canaan. One day, when Yehoshua was there by Jericho, he raised his eyes and looked. In front of him stood a man with his drawn sword in his hand. Yehoshua went over to him and asked him, "Are you on our side or on the side of our enemies?" "No," he replied. "I am the commander of Adonai's army. I have come now." Yehoshua fell down on his face to the ground and worshipped him, then asked, "What does my Lord have to say to his servant?" The commander of Adonai's army answered Yehoshua, "Take your sandals off your feet, because the place where you are standing is holy." And Yehoshua did so. Jericho had completely barricaded its gates against the people of Israel. No one left, and no one entered. Adonai said to Yehoshua, "I have handed Jericho over to you, including its kings and its warriors. You are to encircle the city with all your soldiers and march around it once. Do this for 6 days. 7 Kohanim are to carry 7 shofars in front of the ark. On the 7th day, you are to march around the city 7 times. And the Kohanim will blow the shofar. When they are to blow a long blast on the shofar, on hearing the sound of the shofar, all the people are to shout as loudly as they can. The walls of the city will fall down flat. And the people are to go up to the city, each one straight where he stands." Yehoshua the son of Nun called the Kohanim and told them, "Take up the ark of the covenant and have 7 Kohanim carry 7 shofars ahead of the ark of Adonai." To the people he said, "Move on, encircle the city, and have the army march ahead of the ark of Adonai." When Yehoshua had spoken to the people, the 7 Kohanim carrying the 7 shofars before Adonai passed on and blew on the shofars, with the ark of the covenant of Adonai following them. Fighting men went ahead of Kohanim blowing the shofars, while the rear guard marched after the ark. With insistent blowing on the shofars, Yehoshua gave this order to the people: "Don't shout, don't let your voice be heard, don't let a single word of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you will shout." So he had the ark of Adonai make a circle around the city, going around it once. Then they returned to camp and stayed in the camp. The next morning, Yehoshua got up early. The Kohanim took the ark of Adonai. The 7 Kohanim carrying the 7 shofars ahead of the ark of Adonai went on, continually blowing on their shofars. When the fighting men marching ahead of them and the rear guard following after the ark of Adonai, all while the blowing the shofars was insistent. The 2nd day, they went around the city once and returned to camp. They did the same for 6 days. On the 7th day, they got up early at sunrise, went around the city the same way 7 times. This was the one day they encircled the city 7 times. The 7th time, when the Kohanim blew on their shofars, Yehoshua said to the people, "Shout, because Adonai has given you the city. The city and everything is in it, set aside for Adonai, and therefore to be destroyed completely. Only Rahab, the prostitute, is to be spared, she and everyone with her in her house, because she hid the messengers we sent. So you keep clear of everything reserved for destruction. If you bring a curse on yourselves by taking anything set aside, to be destroyed. You'll bring a curse on the whole camp of Israel and cause great distress there. All the silver and gold and all the brass and iron utensils are to be separated out for Adonai and added to the treasury of Adonai." So the people shouted with the shofars blowing. When the people heard the sound of the shofar, the people let out a great shout. The wall fell down flat. So the people went up into the city, each one straight ahead of him, and they captured the city. They completely destroyed everything in the city with the sword: men, women, young, old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Yehoshua said to the two men who had reconnoitered the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring the woman out with all that she has, as you swore to her." Young men, the spies, went in and brought out Yechav and her father, mother, brothers, and all she had. They brought out all her relatives and put them safely outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the city to ashes with everything in it except the silver, the gold, the brass, iron utensils, which they had put in the treasury of the house of Adonai. But Yehoshua spared Rahab the prostitute, her father's household, and everything she had. She continued living with Israel from then until now, because she hid the messengers Yehoshua had sent to reconnoiter Jericho. Yehoshua then made the people take this oath: "Curse before Adonai on anyone who rise up and rebuilds the city of Jericho. He will lay its foundation with the loss of his firstborn son and set up its gates with the loss of the youngest son." So Adonai was with Yehoshua. The people heard him throughout the land.